Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought what we would do today is have a look at the suggestions past developers for April of 2023. Basically, we're going to have a look at the Naval and also the helicopters in this one, and it has been quite interesting since they changed over the forum, so all of the forum links now don't work, but I'll make sure to include the links which do work now in the description. Absolutely sucks that they made the change, but c'est la vie, that is kind of how it is. There are some articles here. The first one we'll cover is the SMS Blucher, and all I'll say is go read it for yourself, because the article is a fever dream of trying to understand it, and also written in a very, I suppose I'd class it as eccentric way. So the first one is about a dreadnought armoured cruiser from Germany from 1909. This is a name I'll definitely mispronounce, and it is the SMS Blucher, or Blucher, and it's a German vehicle, and it's a pretty interesting one, since of course it was kind of designed after the idea of the Invincible class battle cruisers, this whole like dreadnought armoured cruiser thing, where instead of being a battleship with, or a dreadnought class battleship with a ton of armour, larger guns and all of this, the kind of armoured cruisers or battle cruisers were supposed to be a little bit lighter armoured, but still pack the same punch and then be able to deal out as much damage as the battleships. This was seen as one of the new ways of naval combat. It didn't exactly work very well, especially if you have a look at Jutland and also some other parts. Turns out when you take away a lot of the armor and replace it with speed, it sometimes, means that you can maneuver a little bit better, but also means that when battleships actually range you and hit you, you're generally gonna go boom, which unfortunately there was at least one of these on the British side which found that at Jutland. So the Blucher was very similar to this idea. It was supposed to be a thinner, streamlined battleship design, reminiscent of an upscaled cruiser or a battleship on a diet is probably the best way of putting it. It also had access to some pretty interesting ideas, and what actually ended up happening with the Blucher was that it was larger than preceding armoured cruisers and also carried more heavy guns, but was utterly impotent against its intended counterpart in the Invincible class that could outrun, outgun, outrange, and also utterly outclass the Blucher, all on top of being omnipurpose capital ships that soon coined the battle cruiser moniker after later true battle cruisers like the Indefatigable class and the SMS Von der Tann started showing up and fully matured the ship type itself. And if you don't know about the good old Invincible class, when it comes to the battle cruisers themselves, they were technically the world's first battle cruisers. The Indefatigable class succeeded them in their way. And the HMS Invincible was the one which was sunk at the Battle of Jutland because it just got straight up smashed because of the fact it just didn't have enough armor to survive. And then when it comes to the Blucher and what it had access to, it had access to 18 Schultz Thornycraft coal-fired water tube boilers from across 3 boiler rooms, feeding into 3 4-cylinder VTE steam engines from across 3 engine rooms, which is kind of cool. The armor itself was Krupp cemented armor. It had a belt of 80 to 180 millimeters with 30 millimeters of teak behind it, and the armored belt was 18 centimeters thick in the central portion of the ship, where propulsion machinery, ammunition magazines, and other vitals were located, and then tapered to 80 millimeters in less important areas of the hull. The belt actually tapered down to 0 at either end of the ship, and behind the entire length of the belt armor was additionally 3 centimeters of teak, so that's how it was all set up. The Citadel had 160 millimeters of armor, the casemate had 140 millimeters of armor, and the armament actually on this machine was 6 dual sets of 210mm SK-L45 guns. It had a very similar setup to some of the other battleships that you see in the German tech tree right now, where it had the 4 turrets in the center, but it means that if you want to do a broadside, you could only get 4 turrets on instead of the 6 total which were around. It also had some good old 150mm SKL-45s in little blisters on the vehicle, 4 per side, and then 16 88mm guns mounted in both casemates and also pivot mounts. It also had access to some torpedoes, 4 of them in torpedo tubes, and that was the overall setup. So imagine something like a Von der Tann with a lot less armor and also firepower. The British get a town-class light cruiser in the form of the HMS Edinburgh. Now, the HMS Edinburgh was actually part of a subclass of the town class known as the Edinburgh subclass. This consisted of the Edinburgh and also the HMS Belfast, which we already have in-game in a post-war configuration. This one specifically, the HMS Edinburgh, we're looking at it in its 1942 configuration. So, compared to the other town class counterparts, the Edinburgh subclass was designed to be larger in that they were lengthened and also had a greater beam. This was a part of them being originally planned to use different turrets, as the town class was designed to counter the Japanese Mogami class cruisers, and they were still light cruisers, and in the case of the Edinburgh subclass, they were originally intended to use quad turrets, hence the greater beam. However, due to difficulties manufacturing the quad turrets, these vessels would not be finished with the quads, but would instead use the same triple turrets that were used previously. And in terms of the Second World War, that would end up actually being beneficial. Compared to the town class, their armament was also slightly different, with dual-purpose armaments being increased to 12 4-inch guns compared to the 8 found on other town class cruisers, and also the only other difference in armament that the Edinburghs had was that instead of using the quad 40 pom-pom mounts, these vessels used the larger octuple 40mm pom-pom mounts, but otherwise shared the same armament and were fairly similar. So basically, this machine is what our class is, a town class with a lot more secondary armament on it, and obviously a slightly different design. Would be cool to see though, for obvious reasons. Always nice to have more variance when it comes to naval. The next vehicle is for Japan, and it's the Kaga Battleship, the Kaga. And this one is kind of interesting. So to start with, there is a discussion, let's say, on the name of this thing. There seems to be a discrepancy between English books and also Japanese books about the class name. English books say it is the Tosa class, but Japanese documents and books say it's the Kaga class. So who knows what it could be? My guess would be to go with the actual Japanese on this one, but c'est la vie. We'll have to see what people decide. The Kaga was a third battleship of the 88 Fleet project. This was a Japanese major naval expansion program in the 1920s to compete with the US Navy. The project separated into 3 stages. You had the 8-4 Fleet, 8-6, and 8-8. As shown in the name, they had planned to keep 8 battleships and 8 battlecruisers that were 8 years old or younger, with the total number of capital ships being 48. Also, to support those capital vessels, they planned to build 4 aircraft carriers, 20 cruisers, 88 destroyers, 97 submarines, 5 gunboats, 2 submarine tenders, 14 fleet oilers, 1 repair ship, 1 mine layer, 1 light mine layer, 6 mine sweepers, and also 2 military transports, and also some other stuff. However, though, this project was virtually impossible. Annual maintenance costs reached about 40% of the actual budget. Maintenance costs would be 0.6 billion yen, but in the time, the total budget of Japan was only 1.5 billion yen. Additionally, the IJN planned to start 888 Fleet, which was building 24 new capital vessels and operate 72 of them overall, and if they continued such a naval expansion program, Japan would have just straight up been bankrupt. They just couldn't pay for it. So because of this, the Japanese government agreed that it was necessary to reduce the number of buildings that the naval vessels, or reduce the number of naval vessels they were building, and then signed the Washington Naval Treaty as well. By this treaty, they decided to abolish all Kaga-class battleships, and they planned to use both these ships for target practice, but the fate of the Kaga was actually changed by the Kanto Great Earthquake. Tokyo was basically burnt to the ground 22 years later, but also there was a lot of naval facilities around Tokyo which were damaged too, especially the battlecruiser Amagi that during remodeling to an aircraft carrier was damaged critically, and they decided to dismantle it. So in case of the light cruiser the Naka, they actually rebuilt a new Naka after this dismantle of the old Naka, but in the case of the Amagi, they gave up to rebuild and actually chose the Kaga to convert it into an aircraft carrier. So in 1928, the Kaga was completed as an aircraft carrier. It was an early era carrier, so from kind of the modern person's perspective, it was a very odd design. It had piled 3 flight deck, also armed with 8-inch cannons to fight against enemy vessels. Later, twin turrets were removed, but 8-inch battery was not removed until it was sunk. So overall, this vehicle just had a very odd story, but we're going to focus on the battleship part of it in general. The Kaga-class battleship was a successor to the Nagato-class battleship. So compared to the Nagato class, the Kaga had more modernized armor scheme and also improved weapons. The class was the first Japanese battleship that adopted inclined armor and also a torpedo bulge, and overall had pretty decent armor. The main belt was 11 inches, with inclined 15 degrees, and compared to the Nagato, the maximum thickness was decreased, but it was inclined, so the actual thickness was increased. Also, in the case of the Nagato, the upper plate was 9 inches, and the lower was 3, but in the case of the Kaga, all parts of the main belt were 11 inches. Additionally, the main deck armor was increased from 2.75 inch to 4 inches, and the deck armor consisted of 1.5 inch of HD steel and 2.5 inch of NVNC armor. Behind all of those armors, there are 1.25 inches and approximately 3 inches bulkheads for splinter protection too. So you can see it had a decent amount of armor on it in general. And then also on the top of the vehicle, it had a bunch of pretty interesting stuff as well. The weaponry it had was 5 twin sets of 40 cal 3rd type 41 centimeter twin guns. Then it had 20 type 14 centimeter single guns, a 4 type 8 single AA guns, and also 8 61 centimeter torpedo tubes. So a crazy vehicle in general, and definitely had an interesting life around it, but I would say is pretty cool. Then we have a helicopter for the Republic of China. This is the AIDC UH-1H Iroquois. And this vehicle, the UH-1H, is the definitive variant of the famous Iroquois helicopter, developed from the earlier UH-1D. It featured a relocated pilot tube, as well as a more powerful Lycoming T-53L13 turboshaft, producing 1400 SHP, and in March of 1969, the newly founded Aerospace Industrial Development Corporation began negotiations with Bell Helicopters for the licensed production of their UH-1Hs. On the 13th of August of the same year, an agreement was signed for the licensed production of 50 UH-1Hs for the Republic of Chinese Army, their first true utility transport helicopter. The rollout of the first AIDC-built UH-1s was the 14th of December 1970, and in July of 1971, the AIDC was ordered to build an additional 68 helicopters. Production of AIDC's UH-1H ended in 1976, with a total of 118 helicopters built. In transportation service, the UH-1H could be armed with the Type 57 or the M60 7.62mm door guns. The UH-1H would also become the first gunship in the Republic of China, being equipped with the M3 aerial rocket artillery weapon system. The M3 contained a pair of 24-tube 70mm Mighty Mouse rockets in larger rectangular box-like containers. Later in service, the M3 was replaced with a pair of much smaller 7-tube 70mm Mighty Mouse rocket pods. So the UH-1H was assigned to the 601st Air Cavalry Brigade at Long Tan Air Base and the 602nd Air Cavalry Brigade at Hsinchu Air Base, as well as Aviation Training Command in Guilin Airport. The UH-1H would relinquish its gunship role with the arrival of the ROCA's first dedicated gunship, which was the AH-1W Super Cobra, in 1993. In 2010, the Republic of China purchased new UH-60M Black Hawk helicopters to replace the UH-1H in its transport role. The last of the ROCA's UH-1Hs were retired on December 30th, 2018. As always, thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you next time. I'd just like to thank Millie Draper, Juan the Panda, Nick R. Kupila, Carrion Crow, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie B. Young, Peter Grayling, Jerry Provolt, Bareen, Alan Hacker, Sem Arslan, Uncle Bean, Derek R., and Lafouche for supporting the channel.